Today, Bosch is one of the largest engineering companies on Earth. Over 400,000 employees, revenue north of 90 billion euros, the largest automotive supplier in the world, a position it has held for decades. And somehow, also one of the biggest power tool brands on the planet, competing head-to-head with companies that have done nothing but build tools for their entire existence. Makita since 1958, Milwaukee since 1924, DeWalt since 1924. But Bosch never planned to make power tools, not a single one. The entire division, one that now spans 3 continents and sells tens of millions of units, exists because the European car market collapsed in 1925, and a desperate 64-year. Old founder told his chief engineer to find him anything at all, to keep the factory running. The engineer came back with a hair trimmer for barbers. That hair trimmer led to a grinder. The grinder led to a drill. The drill led to a hammer drill so dominant that construction workers across Europe stopped using the generic term entirely and just called it a Bosch hammer. And the man behind all of it? He couldn't hold a job. He lasted a few months at every employer he ever worked for. This is how a restless apprentice from a farming village in southern Germany accidentally built a power tool empire, and we are going to trace every step from the rear. Courtyard workshop to the 90 billion euro company it became. Robert Bosch's first job after his apprenticeship was at C&E Fine in Stuttgart, the oldest electrical engineering company in Germany, and the same company that would invent the world's first electric hand drill in 1895. Bosch walked through Fine's workshop, handled their electrical apparatus, learned their techniques for building compact motors and precision instruments. Decades later, his own company would compete directly with Fine in the power tool market, using engineering principles he first encountered on their factory floor. But in 1882, he was just another young mechanic who could not sit still. He was the 11th of 12 children born on September 23, 1861, in Albeck, a village near Ulm in the Kingdom of Württemberg. His father, Servatius, was a prosperous farmer who ran a brewery alongside his land. The family was educated, progressive, unusual for rural farmers. Servatius was a Freemason who placed a priority on his children's schooling that few parents of his social standing would have considered. Robert attended the Rehlenstalt in Ulm until 1879, then began a 3-year apprenticeship as a precision instrument maker under a man named Wilhelm Meyer. Meyer was a terrible teacher. He put almost no effort into training his apprentices. Bosch spent 3 years learning as much from frustration as from instruction. And he left with 2 things: a skill set he had built mostly himself, and a conviction that would stay with him for life, that occupational training matters, and that most employers do it badly. That conviction would shape how he treated every worker he ever employed. But that is getting ahead of the story. After leaving Meyer, Bosch became a journeyman, and he could not stay anywhere. He worked at his brother Karl's gas and water installation company in Cologne. He worked at Fein. He worked in Hanau, in Nuremberg, at Schuckert & Co. He never lasted more than a few months. He was not drifting. He was assembling something, a catalogue of skills, techniques, and principles from every workshop that would let him in the door. And he was running from something too. The experience under Wilhelm Meyer had left him with a deep suspicion of employers who treated workers as interchangeable parts. He did not want to work for other people. He wanted to build something of his own. In the winter of 1883, he did something that revealed exactly who he was. He enrolled in lectures at Stuttgart Polytechnic, not to earn a degree, but to overcome what he later described as his fear of technical terminology. He was a mechanic with dirty hands who felt inadequate around engineers with university educations. So he sat in their classrooms until the words stopped intimidating him. He did not earn a diploma. He earned the confidence to talk to men who had one. On May 24, 1884, Bosch sailed for the United States. He found work in New York with Thomas Edison, the most famous inventor in the world. He saw what happens when a workshop becomes a factory, when a factory becomes a system, when a system becomes an industry. He crossed the Atlantic to England and worked with Siemens Brothers in London, manufacturing electrical equipment at industrial scale. By the time he came home, he was 25 years old. He had worked under Edison, Siemens, and Fine. He had studied at Stuttgart Polytechnic. He had built and repaired precision instruments across 2 continents. He had everything except money and patience. On November 15, 1886, Robert Bosch opened a workshop in a rear courtyard building in the western part of Stuttgart. He called it the Workshop for Precision Mechanics and Electrical Engineering. He had 1 journeyman and 1 errand boy. His starting capital was 10,000 marks, cobbled together from personal savings and an inheritance from his father. The money was gone almost immediately. Only a bank loan, guaranteed by relatives because Bosch could not guarantee it himself, kept the operation alive. The workshop installed telephone systems. It installed electric bells. It built and repaired whatever electrical equipment the growing city of Stuttgart required. The work was contract-based, unglamorous, and barely profitable. Bosch reinvested every mark he earned into new machines and better equipment. By 1900, the workforce had risen to 40. There was nothing in this workshop that suggested a future power tool empire. Nothing that suggested a future automotive empire. Nothing that suggested a company that would one day employ over 400,000 people across every continent on Earth. It was a small electrical shop in a rear courtyard, run by a man whose starting capital had lasted less than a year. But what happened next would change the trajectory of the entire company, and it started with a device so unglamorous that most people would have overlooked it entirely. In 1887, a year after opening the workshop, Bosch reproduced a low-voltage magneto ignition device originally designed by the engine manufacturer Deutz. The device generated an electric spark to ignite the fuel-air mixture inside a stationary internal combustion engine, the kind used in factories and agricultural operations. Bosch improved the design. The improved version became the workshop's first consistent seller. The magneto was not glamorous. It was a small component inside a large machine. But it solved a specific problem, the reliable ignition of fuel, with precision that Bosch's competitors could not match. The workshop began to develop a reputation, not for brilliance, for reliability. Then came 1897, and Bosch did something that nobody in the ignition business had attempted. He adapted the magneto, which had been used exclusively in stationary engines, for use in a vehicle engine. The automobile industry was in its infancy. Gottlieb Daimler and Carl Benz were building the first practical motorcars in workshops not far from Bosch's own. Stuttgart and its surrounding region were becoming the cradle of the automobile, and Bosch sat at the center of it. The cars needed engines, the engines needed ignition, and the ignition systems available at the time were unreliable. A car engine that misfired was not an inconvenience, it was a failure. The driver stopped. The trip ended. The horse and carriage waiting patiently at the edge of every road remained the sensible choice. The reputation of the automobile as a viable technology, as something more than a rich man's toy, depended entirely on the engine starting every time, running every time, firing every time. The ignition system was the weakest link in the chain. If it failed, the chain broke and the car went nowhere. Bosch's adapted magneto made the link stronger. The first Bosch magneto ignition for a vehicle engine was installed in a De Dion Bouton three-wheeler in 1897. The three-wheeler started. The three-wheeler ran. The spark arrived when it was supposed to arrive. Word spread among the tiny community of automobile manufacturers who were trying to build machines that actually worked. And then Gottlob Honnold made the one decision that changed everything. Honnold was Bosch's chief engineer, a man who had started at the company as a teenage apprentice. In 1902, he unveiled the high-voltage magneto ignition system with spark plug. The low-voltage systems before it had generated a weak, inconsistent spark. Honnold's system generated a powerful, reliable spark at precisely the right moment, enabling higher speed, higher performance engines that would have been impossible with earlier technology. Bosch registered the patent immediately. Without a reliable ignition system, the car was an experiment. With one, it was a machine. Bosch had built the component that turned the experiment into the machine. The spark plug became the foundation of a company that would eventually touch almost every automobile on Earth. The growth that followed was unlike anything Robert Bosch had experienced. In 1898, he founded his first company outside Germany, in London, with an Englishman named Frederick Sims. A Paris subsidiary followed in 1899. By 1905, Bosch was manufacturing magneto ignition systems in a factory within sight of the Eiffel Tower. Customs duties and the sheer distance between Stuttgart and Paris had made it cheaper to build the components in France than to ship them from Germany. Bosch was thinking globally before most German companies had left their own borders. The early motor races of the 1900s became proving grounds. Bosch-equipped cars won race after race, and the victories generated publicity that no advertising budget could have matched. A car that crossed a finish line with a Bosch ignition system told every manufacturer, every mechanic, and every buyer in the grandstand that Bosch components were reliable at speeds and stresses that destroyed inferior parts. The Bosch name became synonymous with automotive ignition. Every major automaker in Europe wanted Bosch components in their engines. By 1913, the company employed nearly 5,000 people and earned 88% of its revenue from exports. Think about that number for a second. Before the First World War, nearly 9 out of every 10 marks that Bosch earned came from outside Germany. The company was more international than almost any German manufacturer of its era. In 1906, Bosch did something almost unheard of for a German industrialist. He introduced the 8-hour workday at his factory. Germany's standard was 10 hours. Many factories ran 12. Bosch cut to 8 and paid his workers the same wages for fewer hours. The trade unions had been fighting for this concession for decades. Bosch granted it voluntarily, without negotiation, without pressure. He later added profit-sharing, occupational training programs, factory canteens, and health insurance contributions. He was not doing this because the law required it or because the unions had forced it. He was doing it because he believed a well-rested, well-paid worker produces better work. And because the experience of watching Wilhelm Meyer neglect his apprentices back in 1876 had never left him. The man who had been poorly trained as a boy spent the rest of his life making sure no one in his employ had the same experience. By the 1920s, Bosch had expanded its automotive product range far beyond ignition. Electric horns in 1921, windshield wipers in 1926, direction indicators in 1927, injection pumps for diesel engines in 1927. The company was supplying every major electrical and mechanical system that a car required. Bosch was not a car company, it was the company that made cars work. For a while, things actually seemed stable. The product range was broad, the workforce was growing, and the export revenue kept climbing. That didn't last. In 1925, a severe crisis hit the European car market. Sales plummeted roughly 40%. Hundreds of small automakers went bankrupt or were forced to merge. Daimler and Benz combined into one company just to survive. Bosch, which depended almost entirely on the automotive industry for its revenue, was devastated. Robert Bosch, now 64 years old, made a decision that would define the next century of his company. He told his head of engineering, Hermann Steinhardt, directly, "We need other products to keep our production lines running." The sentence was plain. The urgency behind it was existential. If Bosch could not find revenue outside the automotive industry, the company that had taken him 40 years to build would collapse along with the car market. Steinhardt showed Bosch a small device, an electric hair trimmer, a handheld tool with an integrated motor in the handle, designed for barbers and hairdressers. Compact, lightweight, and having absolutely nothing to do with cars. Nothing to do with magneto ignition systems, spark plugs, windshield wipers, or diesel injection pumps. It was a grooming device. A lesser businessman would have dismissed it. A hair trimmer is not an engine component. It is not a serious industrial product. It is a device for cutting hair. But Robert Bosch did not see a hair trimmer. He saw what Steinhardt saw. A principle. The motor in the handle. A self-contained electric mechanism small enough and light enough to hold in one hand and operate indefinitely without fatigue. Not the product. The architecture. The hair trimmer went into production in 1928 under the name Forfex. Barbers across Germany and Europe bought it. The Forfex was a genuine commercial success. But the Forfex itself was not the point. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that follows. Bosch's engineers took the Forfex motor, the principle of a compact integrated motor inside a handheld housing, and began testing it in their own production facilities. The Bosch factory built diesel injection pumps. The factory workers needed to grind, drill, and fasten components at their workstations. The existing tools for this work were large, stationary, and cumbersome. They required the workpiece to travel to the tool. The Forfex principle reversed the relationship. The engineers built compact grinders, drills, and screwdrivers using the motor in the handle architecture. They tested them on their own production floor. The tools worked. They were faster, more flexible, and more portable than anything available on the market. Bosch began selling them externally. The automotive crisis had accidentally created a power tool division. Then came 1932, and Bosch's engineers partnered with a Swedish company that had developed an impact mechanism combining hammer force with rotary motion. The result was something no drill had ever done before. It struck and rotated at the same time. Every electric drill before it could only rotate. To bore into concrete or masonry, a worker drilled a hole, then chiseled it deeper by hand, then drilled again, then chiseled again. Slow, exhausting, imprecise. The Bosch hammer drill ended that cycle in a single motion. One tool. One motion. Concrete, masonry, and stone yielded to it. The hammer drill made its public debut at the Leipzig Trade Fair in 1932. After 2 more years of refinement, it went on sale in 1934 at a price of 600 Reichsmarks, roughly a month's salary for a skilled worker. Expensive by any standard. But the tool was not just a drill. It was also a chisel drill, a caulking hammer, a bush hammer, a compacting hammer, and a vibrating hammer. 7 functions in one machine. The operator who bought one Bosch hammer replaced 7 separate tools. Its first major project demonstrated the economics precisely. The city of Stuttgart needed to reinforce the railings along the wine stage, a dramatic series of outdoor stairs scaling the cliffs on the southern edge of the city. The job required 1,200 anchor holes drilled into stone. With the Bosch hammer drill, the work took fewer than 400 hours. By manual methods, it would have taken 1,100 hours. The tool saved 1,100 hours of labor on a single project. At 600 Reichsmarks, it paid for itself before the first set of railings was complete. On construction sites across Germany, workers stopped calling it a hammer drill. They called it a Bosch hammer. The brand name became the noun, the same linguistic shift that would later happen to steel with chainsaws, to Xerox with photocopiers, to Band-Aid with adhesive bandages, happened first to Bosch with hammer. Drills. When a construction worker asked for a Bosch hammer, he may not even have been asking for a Bosch product. He was asking for the category that Bosch created. Also in 1932, Bosch developed its first standard electric drill and presented its first car radio. In 1933, Bosch introduced its first electric refrigerator for private households. The company that had been exclusively an automotive supplier 6 years earlier was now manufacturing power tools, home appliances, automotive components, heating equipment, and communication devices. The diversification was total. The automotive crisis had been answered. But this wasn't just about Bosch the company anymore. It was about Bosch the man, operating inside a country that was about to make the choices of every industrialist a matter of historical record. Robert Bosch was a complex figure in the era that followed. He was a committed pacifist who had donated millions of marks to charitable causes during the First World War rather than profit from armaments contracts. He funded the construction of the Neckar Canal. He donated to schools, universities, and vocational training programs. In 1940, he funded the construction of the Robert Bosch Hospital in Stuttgart, a homeopathic hospital that still operates today. He was politically active in the 1920s and 1930s, sitting on economic committees, pushing for reconciliation between Germany and France, advocating for what he envisioned as a European economic area with customs-free trade. By every account, he was a liberal businessman dismayed by the rise of National Socialism. But Bosch, the company, operated in Nazi Germany. As early as 1933, negotiations began between Bosch and the Nazi authorities on relocating armaments production. In 1935 and 1937, Bosch founded two shadow factories, Dreilinden Maschinenbau in Kleinmachnow and Trilk Werk in Hildesheim, built in secrecy for exclusive armaments. Production. During the war, Bosch factories used forced labor. The company's own historical literature states that Robert Bosch and his senior executives supported resistance to the Nazi regime and helped rescue Jewish associates and others. Facing persecution, historians have documented both sides: the armaments contracts and forced labor, and the acts of individual resistance within the company's leadership. Robert Bosch died on March 12, 1942 in Stuttgart of complications from an inflammation of the middle ear. He was 80 years old. He did not live to see the end of the war. He did not live to see the destruction of his factories by Allied bombing, or the rebuilding that would follow. Before his death, he had formalized his wishes in a 1938 will. The company should remain independent. It should never be sold. It should be protected from external interference for as many future generations as possible. This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. It would become the single most important structural decision in the entire history of the power tool industry. After the war, Bosch rebuilt. The process was slow and painful. Factories damaged or destroyed. Workforce scattered. Raw materials scarce. Foreign sales, which had been the majority of revenue before the war, took nearly a decade to recover. High transportation costs and customs barriers forced Bosch to seek local manufacturing partners in France, the United Kingdom, Italy, Australia, and Japan. The company that had been a global operation before 1939 had to rebuild its international presence country by country. The Power Tools division, born from a hair trimmer and a hammer drill, grew steadily through the post-war decades. Bosch entered the consumer market with a move that mirrored what Black & Decker was doing simultaneously in the United States, bringing power tools to homeowners who had never used them before. The Bosch Combi, a multi-purpose electric power tool that could serve as a drill, screwdriver, sander, or even a hedge cutter, depending on the attachment, became enormously popular among German DIY enthusiasts in the 1950s. One motor, multiple attachments. The homeowner bought one tool and got an entire workshop. In 1955, power tool production moved from Stuttgart to a dedicated facility in Leinfelden. That move signaled something important. Power tools were no longer a side project squeezed into the automotive factory's spare capacity. They had their own building, their own production lines, their own engineers. In July 1959, Bosch Power Tools was formally reorganized as an independent division of the Bosch Group. The accident was now a permanent business unit with its own manufacturing, its own R&D budget, its own identity, and its own trajectory. And then, the division made a branding decision so elegant that it became shorthand across the entire industry. Green tools for DIY users, blue tools for professionals. The color told the buyer, at a glance, which tier the tool belonged to. No ambiguity, no confusion. No carpenter accidentally buying a homeowner's tool because the packaging looked the same. No homeowner paying professional prices for capabilities they would never use. Bosch Green, Bosch Blue. Two words that told a customer everything they needed to know before picking up the box. The contrast with Black & Decker is worth understanding. In the same era, Black & Decker was selling professional and consumer tools under the same brand name, in nearly identical housings, creating exactly the kind of confusion that would eventually destroy its professional reputation and force the company to resurrect the DeWalt name in 1992. Bosch avoided the same trap by making the distinction visible on the product itself. The color was the firewall between the professional and consumer identities. In 1969, Bosch launched its first cordless power tools, a hedge cutter and a drill, each powered by a 12-volt lead gel battery slung over the operator's shoulder in a bag. The battery weighed 5.5 kilograms. The hedge cutter ran for 1 hour, enough to trim roughly 20 meters of hedge before the battery died. Recharging took 6 to 8 hours. By any modern standard, it was primitive. But the principle was established. Bosch power tools could work without a cord. Through the 1960s, the hammer drill underwent its next evolution. The original 1932 design used a swirl impact mechanism, a purely mechanical system. The new electro-pneumatic system converted electrical energy into mechanical impact using compressed air. More precise, more powerful, less wear on the tool. The original hammer drills had weighed 7.5 kilograms. Through successive generations, the weight dropped steadily. In 1981, Bosch unveiled the world's lightest electro-pneumatic hammer drill. In 1982, Bosch released its first battery-powered drill with an integrated rechargeable nickel-cadmium battery. No more shoulder bags. No more lead gel packs. The battery sat inside the tool itself. In 1984, Bosch introduced the GBH-24V, the world's first professional cordless hammer drill. The tool used a dry battery containing 20 nickel-cadmium cells with internal resistance more than 1/3 lower than conventional batteries. Scaffolders used it at the top of buildings where running cables would be dangerous. Electricians used it to mount antennas and lightning conductors on rooftops. The tool went where the outlet could not. In 1998, Bosch presented cordless drill drivers using nickel metal hydride batteries, the first to eliminate toxic cadmium. Lighter, more compact, higher capacity. In 2000, the 24-volt battery system arrived, powerful enough to drive tools that had previously required mains power. The cordless hammer drill, the cordless reciprocating saw, the cordless circular saw, each one a corded tool set free. And then, in 2003, Bosch did something that echoed the Forfex moment from 75 years earlier. The company introduced the IXO, the world's first power tool with a lithium-ion battery. It was a small, cordless screwdriver. It cost less than a dinner for two. And it sold tens of millions of units worldwide, becoming one of the best-selling power tools in history. The lithium-ion revolution in power tools did not begin with a flagship drill or a professional hammer. It began with a pocket-sized screwdriver designed for homeowners hanging picture frames. Bosch took the same approach it had taken with the Forfex in 1928. Start small, prove the principle, then scale it across every product in the range. Today, Robert Bosch GmbH is headquartered in Gerlingen, Baden-Württemberg, Germany. Annual revenue exceeds 90 billion euros. The workforce exceeds 400,000 people. The company operates in over 60 countries and files thousands of patents every year. It is the largest automotive supplier in the world. The company operates in 4 business sectors: mobility, consumer goods, industrial technology, and energy and building technology. Power tools is one division within the consumer goods sector. It is not the largest division. It is not the most profitable division. Measured against the company's total revenue, it is almost a footnote, a single chapter in a book that runs to several hundred pages. And that is the point. The power tool division that began with a hair trimmer in 1928, born from an automotive crisis, developed on the factory floor as an internal tool and spun out as a commercial product almost by accident, now competes directly with companies that have done nothing but build power tools for their entire existence. Makita, which has been building tools since 1958 and nothing else. Milwaukee, since 1924. DeWalt, since 1924. Fine, the company where Robert Bosch himself once worked as a young journeyman. The company that invented the electric drill in 1895. Bosch arrived in the power tool market as a tourist, a spark plug company looking for something, anything to keep the production lines busy during a downturn. And the tourist never left. Here is the part that most people never hear about. And it is the part that matters most. The company is 94% owned by the Robert Bosch Stiftung, a charitable foundation established in accordance with Robert Bosch's 1938 will. The foundation has no voting rights in the company. It receives the dividends and distributes them to health, social, and educational causes entirely unrelated to the company's commercial operations. The Bosch family retains influence through a separate industrial trust that holds the voting rights. The will specified that the company should serve a purpose beyond profit, that it should be preserved for as many future generations as possible, and that it should never be sold. The ownership structure enacts that specification with surgical precision. The company generates billions, the charity distributes billions. The company is never sold, it is never acquired, it is never gutted. In an industry where TT owns Milwaukee, Ryobi, and Rigid, where Stanley Black & Decker owns DeWalt, Craftsman, Porter Cable, and Black & Decker, where KKR owns Metabo through Koki Holdings, and where private equity firms routinely acquire tool brands, strip their engineering, move their factories, and sell the hollowed-out name to the next. Buyer. Bosch occupies a position that no other company in the power tool industry can claim. It is not family-owned in the traditional sense. It is not publicly traded. It is not owned by a conglomerate. It is not owned by private equity. It is owned by a charity. The largest charitable foundation in Germany holds 94% of a company that started with a magneto ignition device in a rear courtyard and accidentally stumbled into power. Tools because the car market crashed in 1925. Robert Bosch opened a workshop in a rear courtyard in Stuttgart on November 15, 1886. One journeyman. One errand boy. 10,000 marks that vanished almost immediately. He called it the Workshop for Precision Mechanics and Electrical Engineering. 140 years later, the name still understates what it became, and the power tool empire inside it was never part of the plan. If you want to see what happens when the opposite occurs, when a power tool company that started with tools and did nothing else gets acquired, hollowed out, and sold for parts. That video is on screen now.